My son-in-law shoved me into the doorframe of my own kitchen, hard enough that the corner caught my shoulder blade and I had to grab the counter not to go down. I didn't say a word, didn't call the police, didn't even raise my voice. 2 days later, I knocked on his front door and handed him a manila envelope. He saw my face, saw the envelope, and that smug look spread across his face like he'd already won. "Finally came around, did you, Walter?" He grabbed it before I could say anything. He thought it was a check. It wasn't. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a land surveyor in Northern Ontario, working contract jobs that took me out to Timmins, Kirkland Lake, places where the ground freezes 6 months out of the year, and you learn fast that the land doesn't care about your feelings. My wife Barbara passed from ovarian cancer in the spring of 2021, and after that it was just me in the house we built together in Sudbury, our daughter Joanne, and eventually the man she married. His name was Kyle. I want to be fair. In the beginning, Kyle was someone I thought my daughter had chosen well. He was in his mid-30s, worked in financial advising downtown, dressed like he took himself seriously, and when he first came around for Sunday dinners, he'd ask me about surveying, about the land up north, seemed genuinely curious. He remembered things I told him. He called me by my first name, Walter, not in a disrespectful way, just easy and familiar. I told Barbara about him once when she was still well enough to sit up in the hospital bed. I said I think this one might actually be good for her. She smiled and said she hoped I was right. I was wrong. The first time Kyle asked me for money was 14 months after the wedding. He sat across from me at my kitchen table with Joanne beside him, and he explained that he'd left his firm to start his own advising practice, that the first year was always the hardest, that he needed $22,000 to cover his office lease and licensing fees. He had a spreadsheet. He showed it to me on his laptop with columns and projections, the kind of thing designed to make you feel like you'd look stupid saying no. I asked him what the bank said. He said the interest rate wasn't workable. I asked Joanne if she thought this was a good idea, and she nodded in that way she had when Kyle was in the room, chin down, eyes somewhere between agreement and apology. I wrote the check. I told myself it was helping my daughter. He paid back $3,000 8 months later, then stopped. When I brought it up at Christmas dinner that year, he said things were tight, that I, of all people, should understand building something from nothing, that it wasn't like I was hurting for money. That last part landed somewhere I didn't expect. I let it go. 14 months after that, he was back at my table. $11,000 this time. Equipment for the office, he said. A client database system and updated licensing. I told him the original $22,000 wasn't settled yet. He said those were startup costs. This was operational. As if the category changed what I was owed. I said no. He said Joanne would be disappointed. I said Joanne's disappointment wasn't a currency I recognized. He didn't like that. Things changed after the second no, not dramatically at first. Small things. He started being late to family dinners or not coming at all. When I called Joanne, he'd often be in the background and she'd speak carefully, like she was being listened to. Last April, when I drove to their place in Barrie to help fix a leak under the bathroom sink, he barely acknowledged I was there. Stood in the hallway watching while I worked, arms crossed, didn't offer so much as a glass of water. Today he shoved me. We'd been talking about the original loan. I'd sent a registered letter 2 weeks before, just asking for a repayment plan. Something in writing, anything. My accountant had suggested it. Kyle showed up at my house without calling first, came through the front door like he'd been invited, walked straight to the kitchen and stood there with the letter in his hand, and when I said I thought a written agreement was reasonable between family members, he told me I was treating him like a tenant and that I had no idea what kind of pressure he was under. I told him that was between him and his bank. He shoved me, both hands on my chest, hard into the doorframe. He said if I wanted to play hardball, he knew how to play too. I caught the counter. I breathed. I looked at him standing in my kitchen, in my house, and I thought about Barbara. I thought about the last time she'd been in that kitchen, making tea with the radio on. I said very quietly, "Get out." He left. Joanne called 20 minutes later, crying, saying he'd told her I'd threatened him first. I didn't argue with her. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table with a bag of frozen peas against my shoulder and the registered letter still on the counter. And I made a list, everything I could remember, every date, every amount, every conversation. I found the original check stubs in my filing cabinet. I keep records, habit from 30 years of contract work. And I found the one partial repayment, and I found the text messages on my phone going back 2 years where Kyle had asked for money or pressured me about not pushing for repayment. I printed them all. Then I called my lawyer. Her name is Diane Marchetti. She's been my family lawyer since Barbara's estate, and she's the kind of person who speaks in complete sentences and doesn't waste yours. I told her what happened. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "Do you have any witnesses?" I said I didn't think so. She said, "Do you have a security camera?" I said I had a Ring camera at the front door. She said, "Check it." I checked it. The camera doesn't cover the kitchen, but when Kyle arrived, he'd been on the porch first, and the audio had picked up part of the argument through the front window I'd left open. You could hear his voice rising, my voice staying level, and then a sharp thud, which was me hitting the doorframe. Diane said it was imperfect but useful. She said we should document my shoulder. Bruising had spread by morning, dark and ugly, and get medical confirmation. I went to Health Sciences North the next morning. The triage nurse noted soft tissue trauma consistent with blunt impact. I asked for a copy of the report. Diane told me my options: small claims for the loan, a peace bond application through the courts, or, if I wanted to pursue assault, a complaint to OPP. I said I wanted all three. She said, "Let's start with the assault complaint and see how the rest falls into place." 2 days after the incident, I drove to their house in Barrie. Joanne wasn't home. She'd texted earlier that she was working a double shift at the clinic. Kyle answered the door in gym clothes, looking annoyed until he saw the envelope in my hand. Then his face changed. He thought I'd come around. He actually smiled, that sideways thing he did when he thought he was winning something, and he reached out and took the envelope before I'd extended it. Finally came around, "Did you, Walter?" He tore it open. I watched him read the first line. His face went flat. It was a formal notice of intent to pursue legal action for assault, with a copy of the police complaint number and a demand letter for repayment of $19,000, the original loan, minus the partial repayment, plus interest calculated from date of disbursement. He looked up. I said, "My lawyer will be in touch." Then I left. On the drive back up Highway 400, my phone started ringing. Kyle, 4 times. Then Joanne. I pulled into a Tim Hortons in Barrie and sat in the parking lot with the engine running and called Joanne back. She was still at work, speaking in a low, tight voice, asking me what I was doing. I told her I was doing what I should have done a year ago. She said he was her husband. I said that wasn't in question. She said I was making her choose. I said I wasn't. I was protecting myself. She said she needed time to think, and hung up. The next 2 weeks were hard in a specific, quiet way that's harder to describe than the dramatic stuff. No one called. The house was very still. I kept my routine: morning coffee, the news, a walk if the weather held, and tried not to calculate how many calls Joanne wasn't making. Then Diane called with something I hadn't expected. A woman named Gail Thibodeau had contacted her office. She'd found Diane's name through the court filing, which was public record. Gail was in her late 50s, lived in Orillia, and had been a silent partner in an investment property with Kyle 4 years ago. She'd put in $38,000. The property was sold at a loss she wasn't notified about in time to object, and Kyle had taken a management fee she'd never agreed to in writing, totaling just over $14,000. She'd consulted a lawyer at the time but hadn't pursued it. She said when she saw the assault complaint, she decided it was time to stop being quiet. Diane said this established a pattern. I said, "How far back does that pattern go?" We found out 2 days later. A retired shop teacher from Penetanguishene named Howard Beaumont called my mobile. He'd got the number from Gail. His voice was measured, the kind of voice that's learned to stay steady on purpose. He told me his daughter had been engaged to Kyle before Joanne did marry him, broke it off after she caught him funneling money from her joint account for what he told her were investment deposits. When they separated, he'd convinced her the transactions were legitimate and she hadn't pushed it. She was embarrassed and wanted it to be over. Howard said he'd watched his daughter spend 2 years after that being embarrassed for something that wasn't her fault. He said if I was taking this forward, he'd make sure she spoke to whoever needed to hear it. I sat with that for a long time. Then Diane called again. This time her voice was different. She asked if I was sitting down. I said I was. She said, "Walter, there's something about Barbara." Her name went through me like cold water. Diane had been going through the estate records as part of the civil claim, looking at when Kyle first entered Joanne's life, establishing a timeline. She'd found a transfer from Barbara's personal account, August 2020, 13 months before Barbara died, $6,200 sent to an account registered to Kyle's practice. Barbara had noted it in her own handwriting in the account register she kept in the filing cabinet. I'd found it when settling the estate but hadn't understood it at the time. The notation said, "For Joe and Kyle's condo deposit, asked me not to tell Walter. Kyle says Walter would worry about retirement funds." Barbara had been in her second round of chemo. She'd been tired and frightened and trying to make sure her daughter was okay, and she'd given money she could barely afford to give, money she'd kept from me because Kyle told her to, and she died without knowing what kind of man had taken it. I didn't cry in Diane's office. I waited until I was in my truck in the parkade. Then I sat there for a while. I called Joanne that evening. She answered on the second ring, which told me she'd been waiting. I said I needed her to come to my house. Not Kyle, just her. She said she was coming. She arrived, looking like she hadn't slept in days, which she probably hadn't. She sat at the kitchen table where she'd grown up, doing homework, where her mother had made her oatmeal and argued about curfews and helped her study for her nursing entrance exams. I put the bank record in front of her. I didn't say anything. She read it. She read it again. Her hand went to her mouth. I told her about Gail Thibodeau. I told her about Howard Beaumont's daughter. I told her about the timeline, the pattern, the way it had worked each time. Find a woman with access to savings or property or family connections, build trust, position himself as the sensible financial mind in the relationship, extract quietly, escalate slowly, push back hard when confronted. She sat there for a long time without speaking. The fridge hummed. A car went past outside. Finally, she said, "He told me the money from Mom was her idea. He said she'd called him directly because she didn't want to stress you." I said, "I know." She said, "She was in chemo, Dad. She was trying to take care of us." I said, "I know that too." The civil hearing was held at a courthouse in Barrie on a gray Tuesday in March. Diane presented the case methodically, the loan documentation, the partial repayment record, the demand letter, the assault complaint with the audio clip, the medical report. Kyle's lawyer objected to the audio on grounds of privacy. The judge noted it was recorded on a device on private property by the homeowner and overruled. Gail Thibodeau testified about the investment property. Her voice didn't waver. Kyle's lawyer tried to frame it as a misunderstanding over terms. Gail said she had all their emails. Kyle's lawyer moved on. The moment I remember most clearly from that day is when Joanne walked in. I hadn't asked her to come. I didn't know she was coming. She sat in the gallery in her winter coat, and I could see from the set of her jaw that she'd made a decision and that the decision had cost her something. When Diane asked if she had anything to add to the witness list, Joanne raised her hand. Kyle's lawyer objected immediately. The judge asked on what grounds. The lawyer said undisclosed witness. Diane said she was a spontaneous witness to pattern of financial behavior. The judge allowed it. Joanne sat in the witness chair and described finding on her own the account transfers, 3 separate ones she'd discovered by looking at their joint statements after she'd moved out of the house 2 weeks earlier. She'd taken nothing with her except her nursing scrubs and her mother's bread tin. She described each transfer clearly and calmly, the way she would describe a patient intake. When Kyle's lawyer suggested she was motivated by a pending separation agreement, she said, "My mother gave this man money from her chemo fund. There is nothing left to motivate." The room was very quiet after that. The judge found in my favor. Kyle was ordered to repay $19,400 in the civil matter. The assault complaint was referred to provincial court with the judge's notation that the evidence supported the charge. Joanne and I walked out of the courthouse together and stood on the steps in the cold air, and neither of us said anything for a while. She said, I'm sorry I didn't believe you sooner. I said, you believed me when it mattered. That was 4 months ago. Kyle appealed the civil judgment. Diane says it won't go anywhere, that the documentation is airtight, but it means I won't see the money until probably next spring. I've stopped thinking about the money. It stopped being about the money sometime around the day I found out about Barbara. Joanne is staying in the in-law suite at the back of my house for now. It still smells like Barbara's lavender sachets in there, and I thought that might be hard for her, but she says it's the opposite. She's back full-time at the clinic. She eats dinner with me most nights. She doesn't talk about Kyle much, and when she does, it's careful and brief, the way you talk about something you're still deciding what to make of. I went back to see Diane last month to finalize some paperwork, and she said, out of nowhere, "You know what's unusual about you?" I said, "What's that?" She said, "Most clients in your position get angrier as this goes on. You got quieter." I told her I spent 30 years taking measurements in places where the weather doesn't negotiate. You learn to be accurate first, and loud never. She laughed, said that might be the best legal philosophy she'd ever heard. I thought about telling her it wasn't legal philosophy, it was just what Barbara would have wanted, but I kept that part to myself. Some things you carry quietly. I keep coming back to that notation in Barbara's account register, her handwriting. The way she'd written for Joe and Kyle's condo deposit in that careful cursive she used for anything that mattered to her. She was in the middle of chemotherapy. She was tired in a way I couldn't fully reach, no matter how close I sat to her in that hospital room. And still she was quietly making sure our daughter would be okay, making sure there'd be something solid waiting for Joanne on the other side of all that fear. She gave what she had, and she gave it to the wrong person, because that person had been careful to make sure she couldn't see him clearly. That's what stays with me, not the money. The money was always just money. What stays with me is that Kyle understood something about Barbara, that she was decent, that she wanted to protect the people she loved, that she wouldn't want to cause trouble, and he used every one of those qualities against her. That's not bad luck. That's a choice. A deliberate, calculated choice made against a woman who was fighting for her life. And the consequences of that choice didn't end when Barbara died. They kept going, quietly, until they found their way back to him in a Barry courthouse on a gray Tuesday in March. I don't think the universe keeps score in any tidy way. I'm a surveyor. I believe in measurements, in what you can verify, but I do believe this. The way you move through the world eventually shapes the world you're left with. Kyle moved through it by finding where people were soft, where they trusted, where they hoped, and pressing on those places until something gave. For years it worked, then it stopped working, because Gail Thibodeau stopped being quiet, and Howard Beaumont picked up the phone, and Joanne sat down at her kitchen table one night and actually looked at the bank statements. What I had to bring to that process wasn't anger. Anger was easy. I had plenty of it sitting in that parking lot in Barry, with my phone ringing and my shoulder still aching. What I had to find instead was something harder, the patience to document instead of confront, to call Diane instead of driving over there, to let the evidence speak while I stayed quiet. That kind of discipline doesn't come from not caring. It comes from caring enough to stay clear-headed about what will actually work. And Joanne, I think about what it cost her to walk into that courtroom. She loved him. Part of her probably still grieves the person she thought she'd married, but she sat in that witness chair in her nursing scrubs, and she told the truth plainly and completely. And that took a different kind of strength than I have. The kind that holds steady when the thing you're protecting the truth against is also the thing you used to believe in. There's something I've learned from long years of working in the field. A measurement is only useful if it's honest. It doesn't matter how much you want the line to fall in a different place. You read what's there, you record it accurately, you build from what's true, not from what would be convenient. That's not a philosophy I invented. That's just what the work taught me, slowly, over decades. Barbara knew that too in her own way. She built everything she cared about on honesty. It's the reason losing her still feels like losing the fixed point I used to orient from. But it's also the reason I knew, eventually, that staying quiet about what Kyle had done to her memory wasn't something I could live with. Some things you carry quietly, but not forever.